Hey, check it out. We're here.
Welcome to Key House.
I could never get your father to talk about his life here. My kids need a home.
Does it have to be this home?
Hello? Are you my echo?
Yes.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Dolby Institute and Soundworks Collection podcast. We're focusing this season's episode on great sounding episodic content coming to you in your homes. And I'm really glad today to be talking with the team behind a Netflix series called Locke Key. We're here today with J.R. Fountain, who is the supervising sound editor on the show. Morning, J.R.
Hey, how you doing?
Good. And Eric Apps, who is the re-recording mixer on the show. Welcome to the show, Eric.
Hi, Glenn.
So I got to say, this is a really interesting show to me. When we were thinking about, Michael Coleman and I were thinking about putting together this series of podcast episodes to talk about episodic content, I kind of put a call out on social media, specifically around like what shows are really sounding great and what are some really great Dolby Atmos shows to stream at home. And I got so many pings about Locke Key. You guys are doing some really amazing work on this show that your peers in the industry have definitely noticed. And congratulations to you both. It's a really interesting show.
Well, thanks. That's really great to hear.
Yeah. So it's the first season of this show, and we'll get into the specifics of it in just a moment. But I'm kind of curious, always when something like this comes together and it's new, how did you guys get involved with this show, and at what point in the process did you guys come on board?
The producer, the sort of like on the ground producer, is a guy named Raouf Glasgow, who I worked with on The Strain and Colony before that. So he contacted me about the show and told me about it and said he would like to have me on board. So I was sort of I think I was one of the first kind of post people on board with it. And then the rest of the team sort of came together after that.
JR, what about you?
Yeah, so I got involved in the show through Sound Dogs. I've been with them for a number of years. And Nelson Ferreira, who heads up Sound Dogs, he got a hold of me. He thought I'd be a good fit for the show, and that was basically how I got introduced to it.
Well, before we get into some sort of the creative choices and I've got lots of questions about specific scenes and environments in the film. Eric, I want to dig in a little bit more about that. So you guys mixed this show natively in Dolby Atmos in a home theater environment. Can you kind of describe to me sort of what was tell me about the stage, like what's the setup, kind of what's the size, and how did you guys approach mixing natively in Atmos?
Right. So, it was an Atmos home theater format stage. It was a kind of moderate size episodic stage.
Was it is when you say home Atmos, was it 7.1.4 or what's the configuration in the room?
It's a 7.1.4. Well, 7.1.2 beds is what we were using, but it was the 4 ceiling speakers, 8 or 10 surround speakers, and then the LCR and sub on the front wall, and all JBL. All the surrounds and ceiling speakers were the 700, 705, I think, and the I'm trying to remember that Deluxe has, where we mixed it, has a very good JBL system. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it was 714, I guess, effectively.
So, JR, since you guys knew that it was going to be a native Atmos mix all the way through, how did that affect the way you approached the sound design for the show?
Yeah, I think in terms of the Atmos piece of it, I kind of relied a lot on Eric for that. My biggest goal was just to try and provide like all the pieces that he would need. We certainly were thinking about things in the ceiling and moving things around. But I think like Eric really took care of a lot of that kind of stuff once he got on the stage.
We did have a conversation about sort of thinking in terms of things that could go in the height channels and spatial thing, which J.R. definitely took into account in the tracks.
I'm curious, did you guys have any kind of like creative rules of the road? Because I think one of the major kind of creative conceits of the show is that these keys unlock different environments and magical powers. And, and sometimes I've had conversations with artists and filmmakers where they say, I wanted the real world to stay sort of 5.1-ish, but then when we would go into these new environments, that was when we would really open up the Atmos. Was that kind of a guiding principle for you guys, or did that not matter at all?
I think yes and no. It depended really on the source and where we were going and where we were coming from. So, if we were going from the real world into, say, like Bodhi's head, Bodhi's head was just hugely wide. There's stuff all over the place, right? But then back in the real world, it's a little bit more normal or whatever. But then there was other memory sequences where we would flip from the present tense or the real world to this memory, and it would be a lot quieter. So like when we're in the bedroom with Dad and Kinsey, for instance, that becomes a really intimate thing. But it's not so much because it's a flashback or a memory sequence. It's more because it's an intimate scene and we want to be more intimate. And so really the scenes kind of dictated how wide or how narrow we were in our mix.
Yeah, we were trying to, I think, contrast things not so much by sort of this was 5.1 or this is stereo or mono-y or whatever, and this is Atmos when we're in different environments, but more just the style and quantity of sound and stuff. And that, so I was still using the Atmos kind of soundscape in just the regular world quite a lot, but in more subtle and more sort of realistic ways, like hearing seagulls over your head when you're at the sea or something like that, and just trying to make the real world a little more real.
So one of the first keys that we encounter is, I think it's called the head key, and it allows you to whoever uses it to kind of access the inner world of their own brain. And for each character, that's very different. So Bodhi is the youngest child, and his is kind of like it's almost sort of like an arcade sort of environment. I'm blanking on the character's name, but Kinsey, who is the daughter, hers is sort of like a very empty, surreal, huge shopping mall. So tell me a little bit about your approach to building the soundscapes of those internal environments that the characters access through their head keys.
Yeah, so I think our biggest thing was just trying to make them unique to each of the characters. So, so when we go into Bodhi's head, like we were talking about, it's just this kind of like big arcade, really. There's like just stuff going on all over the place. And so, I'm looking at the shot and I'm seeing arcade machines. I'm seeing like him bouncing around on a trampoline. There's like a dinosaur in there. And so, so I'm just trying to think of all the different fun kind of weird sounds I can throw in there. I had like jungle animals, we had like bips and bleeps, and I had like Ferraris driving by and all that kind of stuff, just to really suggest a lot of fun. It's like this little boy, right? So it's like his playhouse kind of thing.
Guys, you gotta come see this. Follow me. Welcome to my head.
Am I just super high?
This is seriously amazing. Who's that?
My glee. Feelings can become living things here too.
How do you know that?
It's my head, I just do.
Okay.
So trippy.
So that was kind of his approach. But then somebody like Kinsey, she's in the mall, and it's a different vibe for sure, right? Like it's still colorful, but it's it's in this mall setting, so it's maybe a bit more subdued. I know like one of the things that was tricky for us there was bringing some life to it. Bodhi's, you've got all this stuff happening all around. It's easy to grab stuff. With hers, we didn't see quite as much, and the visual effects came in a little bit late. And so we tried different things, like these electric trams driving around, and like some elevator beeps and ups and downs for that. And then we ended up kind of paring it back a bit because it just wasn't supported visually enough. So, but then when you get into like the store, for instance, like she has like this little memory store where she pulls up like her dad's memories and stuff. And that was where I tried to take a little bit more musical approach to it. I really got inspired by like Inside Out and how they have like the memory balls in that. And so the cubes that when you pop them out and everything, I tried to make that like a musical kind of note that, boom, and then it slides out. And even for the Atmos in the room, I tried to make like a kind of like a musical drone that sort of played in there and behind. And thankfully we had Torin's score early on, so I was able to tune a lot of those things so they didn't conflict with what he was doing musically. So, but yeah, each of the head keys and those environments, they all kind of had their unique spin on them, and that was kind of the approach to it.
What is it?
The first time Dad took me to the top of the Space Needle. Want to see?
I'm good.
Yeah, you brought up the music, which is Torin Borrowdale's score, who scored the entire season. And it's a really lovely score, and there were certainly some moments where I wasn't really sure if I was hearing music or I was hearing sound design, which is always good fun. But you said that the music that you actually had the music while you were cutting, or was it mock-ups, or what were you working with?
Yeah, so early on, Torin was doing mock-ups, and he would get those into the picture cut, and they would come to us, which was really great. And then they recorded stuff in batches for each of the episodes, and so I was kind of always on our music editor, Kevin Banks, like, hey, do we got any new score that's been recorded, or do we have any new like crash downs that I can grab? And so it worked well for some of the earlier episodes. As we got a little bit on in the show, we didn't get quite as many of those things, but yeah, it was super valuable having that to work against as reference.
Eric, tell me a little bit about the music in terms of from a mix perspective. How were the tracks delivered to you? How much separation did you get, and how did you approach it?
Well, this is something actually I wanted to bring up. I was mixing the sound effects and Foley on the show. There's actually a guy named Christian Cook who mixed the dialogue and music. So Chris was dealing with that stuff. I think for some reason I don't think his name's on IMDb, which, but on this, but as far as I recall, I think we had like 12 5.1 stems for each, and then sort of an A and a B for each cue that Kevin would put together, and so it was quite complex. That I could see from across the console, sort of thing. But also there gave Chris and Kevin a lot of flexibility to if we wanted to make some room for some sound design, we could do things without just taking the music out, obviously. So
were they able to use the Dolby Atmos with the music to kind of spread things out a bit?
Yeah. Oh yeah, definitely. Chris was using the Atmos to not in. More of just kind of generally, I think, in a kind of a soundscape idea, as opposed to moving things around or having stuff fly around the room or whatever. Like it's not really that kind of a score. So it was more just making it sound a little fuller and bigger and spreading it out. But he definitely was using that.
Got it. So the character of the setting of Key House, it turns out, is kind of a major character of the story in the show, and in some ways it almost feels like the house is kind of alive. It's got a long history with his family, and obviously all these magical things happen to it, and It's set over some sea caves and this very kind of magical place. So tremendous possibilities for interesting sound design, even from, the front door opening was a huge like present sound. So can you guys talk a little bit about sort of building that world and your approach to Key House and how you made that sound?
Yeah, so Key House was one of the first things that Raouf, who is our producer on the show, he tasked us with. It's like, okay, let's make this house alive, and I think all of us were really gunning to do that because, like as you said, there was so many opportunities with the way they shot it, just the history that they build up about it, and the mystery behind the house and stuff, and so. A lot of the work that we tried doing was, adding in a lot of wind textures. We tried, playing things from outside, whether it was like a squeaky swing or something, or, different things. And then the other side of it too is just the progression over the show goes from like wintertime to springtime, and into the summer. And so we were trying to play a little bit with that as well, in that, the wintertime didn't really have a lot of birds, or it might just have like the odd crow here or there. But then as we get into spring and summer, we're introducing more birds, and we're introducing some crickets at night and that sort of thing. But one of the challenges with it though was we wanted to do like creaks and like all this kind of like movement inside the house with the wind and stuff. And I think one of the challenges we came up against though was that it felt like somebody was in the house, which you would think would kind of go towards the character of the house. Well, that maybe there is somebody, but it was a bit too much in that it got a little distracting. So we had to be careful about how we played some of that stuff. But yeah, it was a huge amount of fun doing it. And I'm glad you brought up the doors, because to be honest with you, that was actually a big thing for me. Before I'd seen anything, I had the scripts and I thought, well, look, we're doing Locke and Key, right? Like it's gonna need some cool doors. They're gonna have to fit nicely into this old house and stuff. And so my wife and I actually had a really fun trip out to this old mansion that's about 15 minutes from me. It was the owner of GM Canada. His house back in like 1917 it was built. Anyhow, we spent like 3 or 4 hours at this house recording, probably 14 different doors. Thankfully, the security guard had actually earmarked for us as good sounding doors in the house. So yeah, that along with the keys actually as well, like the skeleton keys going in the keyholes. That was actually a big thing for me. I really wanted to nail that, and I thought we could. So yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I appreciate that you guys kind of pulled that stuff back, but it definitely still comes through in some moments. I remember I can't remember which episode it is, but there was a moment I remember I was sitting there watching it. I'm realizing like I'm hearing like a low wind whistle through the house, and it just gave you that sense of like this place is really old. It's probably cold. It's not really weather tight, and it just really contributed to the sense of kind of foreboding atmosphere.
Yeah, I think we tried to keep a character of the house, but very subtle.
So one of the other things that happens a lot in the show is I mentioned at the outset that the dad kind of dies under very mysterious circumstances, and the mystery of that is revealed over the course of the show. There's a lot of flashback work in the show, and a lot of we're accessing memories, so we're spending a lot of time in the past and in the present. Did that sort of nonlinear time structure, how did you guys play with that in terms of sound design? Did the past sound different than the present, or what was your approach to that?
Yeah, I think our approach was really, more in the transitions to like in and out of the flashbacks, and those had like a variation to them. Some were a little more subtle, some were a little more overt, and it really kind of depended at what point in the story we're in. I know early on we had some more overt kind of ones where we were flashing in and out of Rendell's murder, and like we're in Tyler's hockey game or whatever, and I think I used like a whistle, like a referee whistle that kind of reverses and then goes into like a slap shot, which ends up being the gunshot on the other side. And so in those cases, yeah, we're making a big deal about those transitions. But then as we get on like later in the series, we were using just like a really subtle kind of low end to kind of, to get us in and out of those things. And so we didn't really want to call too much attention to it. So I think that's really, that was the direction that we were given anyhow to approach the flashbacks.
Well, I wanted to ask you about that because that's a great kind of, showcase sequence in episode 1. When Nina, who's the mother, uses the key and then goes into this mirror room where things go really pretty scarily wrong. So how did you guys approach the sound design for that sequence? And Eric, what was happening in the mix on that sequence?
Yeah, well, I'll let Eric speak to the mix, obviously, but in terms of the elements that we were providing for that, it was really just filling it out. We needed a ton of glass breaking, and so I spent some time just in my studio here, breaking glass and making it really sharp, and I think sequencing it as well. It needed to have a little bit of rhythm to it. We could see the glass breaking behind them, and so I was really trying to create these trails where it would break on screen and move right and move left and then off and around us, and trying to make those really definitive. So that Eric could kind of play them up and then tail them back and play them up and tail them back, and it would have a bit of a rhythm to it. So it wasn't just like a cacophony, but an orchestrated cacophony, I guess, right, of glass breaking. So yeah, but it was a ton of fun to pull that one together. I think that was one of our big wins, early on, was that sequence.
What the hell?
That can't be real. Mom?
Tyler!
I have to go in.
No!
Here. Use this to get back when you find her, okay?
All right.
Be careful.
Mom. Close your eyes. Just follow my voice. Can you hear me?
I can hear you!
Over here.
Close your eyes. You sound closer. I can hear you!
Pull us up.
Are you all right? What the hell just happened?
I told you, these keys are for real business.
Yeah, we try to take full advantage of the Atmos capabilities with that. And so, pardon the pun, but we're trying to mirror what we were seeing sound-wise a lot, that if you see a bunch of different reflections of Nina walking, then we hear 100 different footsteps kind of in sync, but not really, we spent a lot of time tracking all the camera movement. So when the camera's spinning around through the mirrors and we're seeing different reflections of different voices in different places, again, tracking that stuff around the room with the Atmos panners to just kind of really nail it to the visual.
I really appreciate the tone of the show. It's obviously scary, but it's also there's a lot of fun in it too. There's a really that really fun moment in episode 1 when Bodhi is kind of skating around the house, and it kind of plays a little bit almost like a tip of the hat to The Shining. When those shots of Danny kind of riding his bike around the Overlook Hotel, and you can kind of tell that the filmmakers are having some fun with this.
Yeah, the tone of the show is really great. You're oscillating between a little bit of horror, a little bit of comedy, a little bit of family, a little bit of just kind of like fantasy and mystery. And I think that was actually one of the great things about the show for us working on it is that they wanted to keep it a little bit lighter in spots. I know, like, I was sending some of these transitions back and forth to Raouf just for him to preview before our mixes and stuff, and he'd send it back to me like, no man, too horror. It's like, it's too shrieky, or it's too percussive or whatever, right? And so I'd go back at it, and I'd send him something back that's a little bit more toned down. But yeah, like it's a family kind of show as well, right? And so we're trying to reserve our scary times for when we need them. We're not trying to play that too much all the time.
If you're familiar with the books, there's much more sort of horror oriented, and they actually made, I believe, a couple different pilots in the past several years and it wasn't until they toned down the horror and sort of made it more magical and focused on the family aspect of it that was what clicked.
So there's another one of my favorite kind of signature elements, and it's subtle, but it's really important, is how they find the keys. And the way they find the keys, the kids, is that the keys kind of whisper to them. And at first, Bodhi is the only one who can hear it, but then the others start to hear it as well. Tell me about the process of creating the sound of the whispering, because it's not intelligible language that I could make out. But how did you guys arrive at the sound of what that was gonna be?
Yeah, the whispering was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed this part. Again, it was like one of the first things we had to do because we knew it was going to be a recurring kind of theme and motif, through the series. And I can't remember if it came from Roof or from Carlton, but somebody had said something about like a lyrical language. They wanted to be kind of like Elven, or Elvish, but they didn't want it to sound like Harry Potter either. So, but I kind of latched onto this lyrical part of it, and one of my ideas was, okay, well maybe I'll just try and find some poetry and I'll read it backwards. And that'll be kind of the language that we use. And so I grabbed I can't remember what it was, but like a chunk of Shakespeare, a chunk of like Emily Dickinson or something like that. And so I started just doing it backwards, whispering, or reading it backwards, whispering, and then layering that up. And then I sent that off as a proof of concept. And they were like, yeah, we really like the language, but we don't like the male part of it. We don't, like, you sound too big and gruff, for like the kids. It's got to be something a little bit more enticing, I guess, or welcoming, I guess, for the characters to want to, to chase after. And so I ended up enlisting like my daughter and my wife and a nephew, a niece, and like 3 of the kids down the street from my house. And so I brought them in kind of one at a time. I had, like a half a dozen different phrases that I'd written out on a piece of paper for them, and just had them record each of the lines, at different speeds and kind of different intensities. And and then I pulled all that stuff back and tried to start layering it. And then there was a lot of experimenting with the layers as well. I had a lot of like reverse delays and a lot of more just like sustained kind of sort of tones that would go through it. And that was sort of the first iteration of it. But then by the time we finally got it down, after we got notes from our producers and notes from Netflix, it really simplified a lot, so that we were playing not single voices all the time, but it would be sort of a single voice that would start and then grow into multiple voices and then just cut off. And I actually really ended up liking it that way, as opposed to how I'd had it before. It was, just the simple aspect of it, I think, sort of told the story a little bit more clearly. But it was fun to do, and I think a great piece for the show.
We started off with the whispers being very much kind of not physically connected to anything. So you're hearing things in different places in the room, and sort of what's that kind of feel. And again, we toned that back and took out some of the delays and made it a more focused sound that kind of would draw the kids into the key.
Talk to me about episode 10. There are so many great sound moments in episode 10 with the Omega Gate and like the shadow monsters that come in. You guys must have spent a lot of time on that episode.
What is that?
That episode was huge. It was one of those ones actually where there was so much that happened over the course of, I think, like the first 10 or 15 minutes of the show, that when we were in playback, we played it back and you're like, are you for real? That was all that work just gone in like 10 or 15 minutes. So yeah, as you said, there was, we had the creatures, which was something that was a lot of fun. I think, our direction on that, was that they were these shadow monsters from sort of like another realm. They were sort of demonic, but there was definitely a lot of mystery around them. So we didn't have tons to go from in terms of like mythology that the writers or the producers had kind of built up behind it. I know, one of the concepts I tried working with was that as the shadows sort of creep along the ground and then into the house, was that they tried to affect sort of the surface they were on. So you'd hear the gravel kind of rumbling and shifting, and then as it moved into the house, you'd hear the floors creaking, and up the walls, you'd hear the drywall, cracking a little bit. And so that was fun, just to kind of play that mystery part. And we had like a vocal element to that I worked on, just to kind of give it some drama, right? And but then we have like the significant difference for them is when they pop off the walls, and then they become a little bit more sort of typical creature, and that's where we start adding more like animal elements and things like that to give them some of the ferocity and like their attacks and their growls and all that kind of thing.
Well, I think I'm just thinking probably the mirror room stuff or the mirror door stuff, or the what is it the prison of the self, I think it's called. That's just every time I've watched that, it's like, that we really nailed it with that one. That's an awesome environment. And inside Bodhi's head was also just so much fun, with all the different sounds and all the I just love those kind of sounds. It makes me happy to hear them. All those kind of happy game sounds. So those are two memorable scenes.
Sometimes with the kind of fantastical atmospheres and obviously a show that's shot primarily on location, sometimes the production tracks are kind of an interesting challenge to work with. But what was the material that came in to you guys, and how was it recorded on set, and did it pose any interesting challenges for you?
For the most part, the production sound was really well recorded, which leaves a lot of room for sound design to do things, because we're not kind of dealing with noise or challenges in the production sound. But also, Dustin Harris, who's the dialogue supervisor, did a lot of treatment on things like when Shadow Dodge in episode 10, the treatment of her voice and stuff. And having clean production sound, you can do a lot with it without getting artifacts and things like that. So, for the most part, I think the production sound was did what it needed to do. It was just well done.
Yeah, so I think for the most part, like Eric said, the tracks came in really good. I know we had a few scenes that were difficult, in particular like the sea caves. because all of that was set, and it basically just sounded like wood and not styrofoam, but like plastic, really dull sounding. Obviously not rocks or whatever in terms of their production movements and just the space around it. I know we had another scene as well that was difficult. They were walking through the forest, and it was just a ton of leaves on their footsteps and things like that. And so, but the cast really came through. Dustin Harris, who was our dialogue supervisor, really came through on pulling together some really great ADR for each of those scenes that sits really naturally. And our Foley team as well. We got to give a huge shout out to them. They provided a ton of detail on all of our tracks and stuff, and really helped out some of those scenes that had to get filled out with ADR.
So guys, it's been really fun talking with you today about Locke Key. This is it's a special show with some pretty amazing sound, and a lot of your peers in the industry have called out, like I said, the Dolby Atmos mix on it as being really spectacular. So congratulations. This is pretty amazing work. You guys are based up in Toronto. Eric, you mix at Deluxe, right? And JR, you were Sound Dogs?
You see, I'm actually freelance, so I work at a number of different places. The Deluxe and Technicolor are kind of the two big houses in Toronto, that's where I've been doing most of my work for the last several years.
Yeah, Sound Dogs is where I hang my hat most of the time. I do a little bit of work outside of there, but Nelson Ferreira, who heads it up, he's just been really great to me, and I've just learned a ton there. So I do a lot of my work through them.
Great. Well, it's been a great pleasure having you guys on the show and talking with you today. Obviously, Netflix has announced that there's going to be a season 2, but it hasn't started production yet. I mean, I can't wait, because you guys left these poor characters in quite the lurch. We got Ellie stuck behind the Omega Gate. Like, what's going to happen? Well, thanks again, guys, for doing the show and for taking part in the conversation today.
Oh yeah, you bet, Glenn. Thanks so much for all you guys are doing with this show. It's really great.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Glenn. And Michael?
Great. Well, this has been another episode of the Dolby Institute and Soundworks Collection podcast. Today we were talking about Locke Key. Come back again next week. We're going to be talking with the team which did the show Unorthodox, about the work on that show. So, JR, Eric, thanks again for joining us and doing the show. It was great talking to you today. This is Glenn Kaiser signing off from the Dolby Institute. Bye-bye.